The dinner table was set for 4. Vegetables, chopped chicken marinating, a half-full sippy cup sat by the sink. Their 2 dogs barked in the backyard like they were waiting for someone. Inside popcorn in a bowl, a movie paused. But the Halden family, gone. No note, no struggle. Just the house. Waiting. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and if stories like this have ever brushed past your life, tap that like and subscribe. Every click helps bring one more name back into the light. My name's Michael Halden. I'm 41 now. I've lived most of my life in San Diego County, but back in 2010, I was still up in Vista, working commercial installs, security systems mostly. I wasn't far from my older brother Joseph, who had settled with his wife and kids just a little ways east out in Fallbrook. Joseph was the kind of man who never raised his voice. He built things. Fountains, mostly ornamental water features handmade from stone and concrete. His shop always smelled like wet dust and motor oil, and when you stopped by, there was music playing low in the corner and a breeze coming through the back gate. His wife, Lena, she was quieter than Joseph. Kept her hair pulled back, always had one hand on a child and the other on whatever was next. She had this eye for detail, used to work real estate, helped stage homes. But more than anything, she was steady. Calm in a way that grounded the rest of us. They had 2 little boys, Johnny and Joey Jr., 4 and 3. You couldn't tell one story without the other, always into something. Their backyard was half finished. Joseph had started putting in a garden, but the boys had claimed it with Tonka trucks and buried Hot Wheels. I still remember Johnny dragging out a plastic toolbox like he was about to rewire the sprinkler system. He'd swiped a screwdriver from Joseph's truck, never got in trouble for it. Their house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, 1-story stucco red tile roof. Modest, warm. Fallbrook's the kind of place where folks wave from driveways but don't meddle. The kind of town where routine becomes invisible. And the Halden family had a rhythm. Joseph would be in the driveway, early loading tools. Lena walking the boys after breakfast, waving at the same 3 neighbors. Saturdays were park days. Sunday afternoons, Joseph grilled chicken, while Lena picked leaves out of the pool net with one hand and held a juice box with the other. It was normal, which is why I still can't make sense of what happened. Because there weren't any warning signs, no tension, no fights, no debts. They had plans. A vacation maybe once business steadied. Fixing the garden. Maybe putting in a playset. February 4th, 2010. That was the last time anyone saw them. I didn't know it then, but something had already shifted. Joseph called me earlier that week just to check in. We talked about a tool he'd been needing some part for a water pump. Said he'd follow up later, but he never did. And on that Thursday, their SUV pulled out of the driveway just before 8 p.m. Quiet. No headlights. No rush. 3 days later, their phones were off. By Sunday, my calls were going to voicemail. At first, I thought maybe they'd gone camping. Joseph did that sometimes last minute. But when I drove out to Fallbrook and stood outside their house, something didn't sit right. The dogs were still in the yard, barking, hungry, and nobody came to the door. I walked around the side calling Joseph's name. That's when I saw it. The back window cracked open, just enough for a breeze, and something inside me said, "You need to go in." I pushed the window open just wide enough to get through without knocking anything over. The house smelled faintly like old coffee and stale popcorn. That's what hit me first. Not rot, not anything sinister, just stillness. The kind of quiet that feels off like someone pressed pause on a life mid-motion. I stepped down into the living room. The couch cushions were dented like someone had just gotten up. A fleece blanket hung off one side. 2 small bowls of popcorn, one half-eaten, sat on the coffee table next to a juice cup with condensation still clinging to the sides. A children's movie was frozen on the TV screen. I didn't even breathe for a second. Just stood there listening for anything. But the house didn't make a sound. Not a creak. Not a footstep overhead. I moved slowly into the kitchen. There were eggs on the counter out of the fridge, but not spoiled yet. A skillet on the stovetop. The kind of clutter that says dinner had been in progress, not cleaned up after. No dishes stacked in the sink like they'd eaten and gone. Just left. In the dining room, the table was set for 4. Forks, napkins, placemats with cartoon trucks on them. A plastic booster seat pulled up on one side. It looked like any normal Thursday night, except nobody was there to finish it. I called out their names. First just Joseph, then Lena, then the boys. Nothing. I checked the bedrooms, beds made, laundry half folded on the foot of their bed, a basket of clean clothes by the hallway closet. There were toys on the floor in the boys' room, shoes lined up by the wall. I opened every door I could find, pantry, bathroom, garage. All the lights worked. The power was on. In the fridge there was milk orange juice yogurt cups with the foil still intact. I stood in that kitchen and kept expecting someone to come walking in from the backyard, maybe Joseph with a bag of soil, maybe Lena calling the boys in from the fence line. But there was no movement, no sound. The SUV wasn't in the driveway. Neither dog had been fed. They were in the backyard, pacing and whining, bowls, empty paws, muddy from digging near the fence. Joseph and Lena wouldn't have left them like that. Not for a night, let alone several days. I looked through the mail on the counter. Bills, coupons, nothing opened in at least a week. Their phones went straight to voicemail. I dialed them both twice. Then I sat on the edge of the couch and waited as if maybe they'd walk in any minute and explain everything away. But they didn't. I called Dad, told him something wasn't right. I said it quietly, trying not to let it settle too deep in my chest, but he heard it in my voice. By the next day, February 13th, he was calling around trying to reach anyone who might have seen them. Neighbors, Lena's sister, some of Joseph's clients. Nobody had heard a thing. I filed the report on the 15th. Missing persons, 4 of them. Joseph, Lena, Johnny, and little Joey Jr. The San Diego County deputies arrived later that afternoon. They walked through the house slowly, just like I had, taking notes, noticing the same strange contradictions. Nothing was broken. No signs of forced entry. No overturned furniture. Nothing that screamed abduction or panic or struggle. Just quiet. Too quiet. It didn't add up. They brought in a forensics team the next day once the warrant cleared. Photographed everything. Took prints. Bagged a few small items. Receipts, cell chargers, a laptop. But the first walkthrough left them as puzzled as we were. I heard one of the deputies mutter that the place looked like a model home staged but lived in. They were right. It felt frozen, not emptied. On the 19th, the team did a deeper sweep. Pulled data from the home computers. Checked credit cards. Social media. Joseph's business email. Nothing since the 4th. That was the last date any of them had logged into anything. There were no flagged withdrawals, no flight records, no hotel check-ins. Their passports were still in a drawer by the master bed. Lena's had expired a few years back. The boys never had any. That killed the idea of international travel almost immediately. Their bank accounts still held over $100,000, none of it touched. That's not how people run. If they were trying to start over somewhere else, they'd need money, and they'd need documents. The investigators started combing through phone records. The last ping from Joseph's cell came from a tower in Fallbrook around 8:30 p.m. on the night of the 4th. A call was placed to someone named Charles Merritt, a name I didn't recognize at first. The call went to voicemail. Merritt told police he never picked up because he was watching a movie. Said he figured Joseph would call back later. But Joseph didn't. They tracked the SUV next. An Isuzu Trooper. White with minor scratches on the driver's side. No hits on toll booths, traffic cams, or license plate readers. It was like the car had vanished. Finally, someone at the sheriff's department suggested maybe they'd left voluntarily. They'd found internet searches on the family computer questions about travel to Mexico about what documents were needed for kids. There were also Spanish lesson downloads. They said it could explain the sudden disappearance. Maybe they crossed the border without telling anyone. It didn't sit right with me. Joseph never trusted traveling down there. He told me once he wouldn't even take a day trip across unless he absolutely had to. Said it made him nervous. He and Lena had talked about going to Arizona one day, maybe New Mexico, but Mexico, not with the boys. But the theory gained traction. Some grainy footage surfaced border checkpoint video that supposedly showed a family of 4 walking into Tijuana. 2 adults, 2 kids. The footage was too low res to confirm anything, but it was enough to grab media attention. Headlines exploded. Theories followed. Talk shows. Online forums. People were convinced Joseph and Lena had taken off to start fresh, that they'd snapped under the weight of business kids' bills, that maybe something darker had happened between them and they'd fled to avoid it. A man even wrote a book claiming Lena had murdered her family and vanished. He'd never met her, never even spoken to anyone who knew her. But he said she was unstable and jealous based on hearsay and speculation. I tried not to read any of it, but it found me anyway. People I hadn't heard from in years were calling to ask if it was true, if I thought Joseph had planned it, if I thought Lena had it in her. I didn't. Not for a second. Not them. Joseph had his faults. He could be stubborn, and he let work eat up more of his time than he should have. But he loved those boys. Lena, too. She was solid, protective. She watched everything, especially around strangers. She wasn't the type to disappear, and she damn sure wouldn't take her kids into cartel country without saying goodbye. The detectives were still digging. They looked into Charles Merritt more seriously. Turned out he wasn't just a business acquaintance. He was a fabricator Joseph used for his fountains. Had a record, too. Felony burglary, receiving stolen goods. Even did time a while back. He was the last person Joseph called. That stuck with me. But Merritt passed a polygraph, said he hadn't seen or heard anything suspicious, and kept repeating the same story. He even said he wanted to write a book about the case himself. At one point, he implied Lena's temper had caused tension in the family, that maybe she'd snapped. Same theory the tabloids had jumped on. I told the lead investigator everything I could remember. I gave them access to Joseph's work emails, pointed them to old invoices, voicemail messages, even client records. I didn't know what else to do. And as weeks turned into months and months into years, the house just sat there. Eventually, it was boxed up, sold. The garden Joseph had started out back withered under the heat. We'd drive by sometimes. I'd slow down at the curb, roll down the window. Nothing moved. The curtains stayed drawn. The mailbox sealed shut. But inside, in my mind, I could still see the bowls of popcorn, the juice cup, That old blanket slumped across the couch like someone might still be napping underneath. Something wasn't finished there. Something hadn't let go. And I wasn't the only one who felt it. Not long after the 3-year mark, a call came through. Someone had found something in the desert. Bones, they said, near Victorville. Shallow, half buried. And just like that, the silence cracked. At first, the news didn't go wide. A couple of officers responded to the call from the desert and kept it tight. They didn't want the media swarming before they knew what they had. But I got a call from someone in the department I used to know through an old alarm install job. He just said, "Mike, I think you need to come down here." He didn't say more. Didn't have to. I drove straight out to Victorville. Long stretches of nothing. The kind of place people pass through but don't stop in. You could smell the dry in the air dirt and sun-baked metal. When I got there, they had the scene roped off. Tarp set up. A few white suits moving slowly between brush. A forensics van pulled off the access road. One of the techs walked up to me, didn't say much, just nodded and held up a clipboard for my ID. I signed it without asking. My hands were steady. My chest wasn't. What they'd found was shallow. Disturbed ground not more than 2 feet deep. The soil still loose in spots. Not just one grave. Multiple. Clustered. Some bones exposed. A bit of fabric, sun-bleached and torn. I saw part of what looked like a car seat strap, and I had to turn away. They worked in silence. No one rushed. No one speculated out loud. It was like everyone already knew. It took 2 days to confirm through dental records and DNA. But even before the names came back, I could feel it in my spine. Joseph. Lena. The boys. They were all there. Together. Hidden in a stretch of land where no one had any reason to look. Buried under sky and dust like they were never supposed to be found. The detectives didn't talk much on the drive back. I sat in the back seat just listening to the road under the tires. When we got to the station, they walked me through what they'd found. No signs of animal activity. No major decomposition damage, which meant the bodies had been placed there with some care. They were still wearing the clothes they'd last been seen in. No ligatures, but signs of blunt force trauma. The boys had been wrapped together in a single blanket. Summer had fractures to her ribs and skull. Joseph's injuries were consistent with multiple blows to the head and chest. The medical examiner used the words controlled, deliberate, and repeated. It didn't look like chaos. It looked like someone had made decisions. Back home, Dad sat in the same chair he always did, hands folded under his chin, just nodding while I explained. I didn't use the words the detectives used. I didn't tell him about the hammer. Not yet. He asked where the car was, and I told him it still hadn't been found. That part confused all of us. If they'd been taken in their own vehicle, where did it go? How do you make a car disappear in California without a trace? Then about a week later, we got word. The Isuzu trooper had been towed from a shopping plaza down near the border in San Isidro. It had been sitting there for days after they vanished, just left in a corner of the lot behind an old strip mall. It hadn't been wiped down. The kids' car seats were still inside. One of Joseph's tools was in the back. A half-used bottle of Gatorade in the cup holder. And in the center console, DNA. Not just from the family. From someone else. They ran it. Took a few days. But when it came back, the detectives called me straight away. Charles Merritt. The same guy Joseph had called the night they vanished. The last known contact. The one who told investigators he was watching a movie and hadn't thought anything of it. At that point, the tone shifted. Before Merritt had been treated like a person of interest. Now he was a suspect. They went through his financials, and what they found hit hard. Within days of Joseph's disappearance, Merritt had written himself over $20,000 in checks drawn from Joseph's business account. Earth-Inspired Creations, the company they were building together. The checks had Joseph's digital signature. The dates lined up right after the 4th. Merritt deposited them and took most of it straight to casinos. Thousands lost in a single weekend. Security footage confirmed it. He wasn't even trying to hide. They brought him in, asked again. Merritt stuck to his story. Said he didn't know anything. Said the checks were authorized. Said Joseph had been stressed, had talked about needing a break. He implied again that Lena had been unstable, that maybe she'd done something, that maybe Joseph had been trying to protect the boys from her. None of it made sense. The more he talked, the looser the pieces got. He said Joseph had been sick, said Summer had snapped, but no medical records ever showed anything serious. And Lena's sister Melissa told investigators that Lena had been in good spirits, that she was talking about redoing the boys' room and planting vegetables in the spring. Still, people bought the Mexico theory, talk radio, local reporters. Even some national coverage picked it up. All that old footage of the border crossing came back again. The grainy clip of a family of 4 walking into Tijuana. People said maybe the bodies weren't real. Maybe they'd staged it. Maybe someone else had planted the bones. I stopped answering my phone. Dad told me not to read the papers, but I did. I couldn't help it. Even after the DNA confirmed it. Even after the remains were matched, article after article still called it alleged. Still used phrases like possibly linked. The sheriff's department held a press conference, but it didn't do much. The voices online were louder. Then Merritt did something I didn't expect. He offered to write a book. Said he wanted to set the record straight. Said people needed to know the real Joseph. When I heard that, something in me snapped quiet. Not angry, just clear. I called the detective in charge and said, "Do what you need to do." He told me they already were. That they'd found trace amounts of Merritt's DNA on the sledgehammer buried in the same grave as Lena and Joey Jr., that it matched the tool used in the murders, that the checks, the timeline, the cell data, it all pointed in one direction. But they still had work to do. They still had to make it stick. They were building the case brick by brick, and they warned me it was going to take time. I drove back out to Fallbrook that evening, parked across the street from Joseph's old house. The new owners had put up a different mailbox, changed the shutters. But the slope of the roof was the same. I sat there for a while, just watching the porch light flicker against the stucco. The neighborhood was quiet, same as before. Sprinklers clicked on somewhere nearby. I thought about the boys' bikes, how they used to lean them up against the garage door like they were too busy playing to park them right. There was no noise in that house now, no laughter, no toy trucks rolling across tile, just a kind of quiet that doesn't settle. And in that quiet, I kept thinking about something Merritt had said during one of his interviews, that Joseph had trusted too easily, that he didn't like confrontation. I wondered not for the first time what exactly that trust had cost him, and how long Merritt had been planning to turn it into something else. I kept going over the timeline in my head, trying to find the moment where everything slipped. I'd drive from Vista to Fallbrook, then out to Victorville, then back again, and none of it brought me any closer to understanding how a man like Charles Merritt had gotten so close to my brother's life, close enough to sit in his truck, touch his tools, sign his name, and none of us saw it coming. People started pulling back after the arrests. The reporters backed off, neighbors stopped calling. It felt like everyone thought things were wrapped up. The bodies had been found. There was a suspect in custody. But that wasn't closure, not for us. Not for Dad, who still watched the local news every evening like someone might come on and say it had all been a mistake. Not for me, waking up in the middle of the night with my heart racing because I couldn't remember if Joseph had ever mentioned feeling scared. If I'd missed something in his voice that last time we talked. The problem was the world moved on, but we didn't. And the silence that came after the headlines faded was louder than anything before it. I tried keeping busy, went back to work, had dinner with Dad a few times a week, tried to keep him from letting the mail pile up or the lawn get overgrown. But I wasn't sleeping. I'd lie awake thinking about those check stubs, those forged signatures Merritt sitting at a diner somewhere with my brother's money in his pocket like it was nothing. I started requesting every file I could get access to public court records, evidence lists, any witness statements that weren't sealed. I wasn't trying to run my own investigation. Not exactly. I just needed something to fill the space between what I knew and what I couldn't let go. That's when I started noticing things that hadn't made it into the news. Small things. Discrepancies. One of the receipts Merritt submitted to back up those forged payments dated February 6th, 2 days after the family vanished, was for a parts delivery supposedly made to Joseph's workshop. The signature on the form was Joseph's, but the handwriting didn't match. Not even close. It wasn't just the style, it was the pressure, the angle. Joseph had a left-leaning scrawl, and this one was tight and upright. I brought it to the detective. He nodded, said they'd already flagged it, that it had been entered into evidence, but his tone was tired, like this was just one more thing on a pile they couldn't act on yet. Still, it nagged at me. The deeper I looked, the more uneasy I felt. Not just about Merritt, but about the cracks that had opened up in our own circle. People who used to visit the house started distancing themselves. One of Joseph's old business clients, someone he'd built a full patio fountain for the summer before, gave a statement saying he wasn't surprised something went wrong, claiming Joseph had been getting in over his head with new partners. I remember that man. He came to their 4th of July cookout, brought his wife and their dog, sat at the picnic table and let Lena refill his iced tea. And now here he was, shrugging off Joseph's murder like it was bound to happen. That part of grief, the slow unraveling of what people really thought, it got heavy fast. I met with Lena's sister once a few months after the bodies were found. Melissa. She drove down from Fresno, and we had coffee on a Thursday morning at the corner diner off Mission. She wore her hair pulled back like Lena used to, and when she smiled, it hit me hard. We talked mostly about the boys. She told me Lena used to sing to them at bedtime this soft, off-key lullaby their mother used to hum. I'd never heard it before. It made me wonder how much of my brother's life I'd never fully seen. Melissa didn't stay long. She'd kept quiet through the whole investigation out of respect, she said. But I think she was just trying to protect what was left. She asked me if they ever found Joey's stuffed elephant, the one he carried everywhere. I told her no. It wasn't in the house, wasn't in the car, wasn't in the graves. And for some reason, that hit her harder than the autopsy report. Around that same time, the sheriff's office announced a delay in Merritt's preliminary hearing. Something about changes in legal counsel. He'd fired another attorney, his third. Decided to represent himself for a while. That's when I realized we were in for the long haul. The prosecution was gathering evidence, but every time they tried to push forward, Merritt would throw up another roadblock. File new motions, request continuances. The press called it strategy. I just called it delay. And every delay meant more time where our lives stayed stuck, hovering somewhere between what we'd lost and what we still couldn't say out loud. like how exactly he got them out of that house, how he managed to silence a family of 4 without anyone noticing, how no one heard a struggle, no screams, no crash, just gone. I went back to Joseph's neighborhood in late fall. It had been almost 4 years since they disappeared. I stood across from the house and looked at the new porch lights, the fresh paint. The people who lived there now had no idea. I don't blame them. Life goes on. But as I stood there watching the sprinklers tick through the front yard, I remembered something Joseph told me once. It was after a long day on a job site years before he started Earth-inspired creations. We were sitting in his garage drinking cheap beer, and he said, "Mike, people think safety is having locks and lights and cameras. But it's not. It's knowing the people you let through the door." I didn't say anything at the time, just nodded. But that sentence kept circling back now, heavy with a meaning we never imagined it would carry. Merritt had been through that door, sat at their kitchen table, shared meals, rode in their car, handed Johnny tools to play with in the shop. Every part of their lives that had once been protected by familiarity had been pierced by someone they thought they knew. And the worst part, the part that stayed with me most, was that Merritt hadn't just planned to take money. He'd planned to erase them. Every trace. Bury the car, leave the dogs, toss the story into a border theory so flimsy it almost worked. And if that man in Victorville hadn't stumbled across those bones, I don't know how long we would have waited, or what lies Merritt would have told next. There was still one piece missing, one detail that didn't sit right and hadn't from the beginning. The morning before Joseph disappeared, he'd placed an online order for materials custom sealant, the kind they used only for specific high-end projects. The invoice was never fulfilled, the delivery never made. But when I followed up with the vendor months later, they told me something I hadn't heard before. That same sealant had been reordered under Joseph's account the next day, February 5th. Same product, same quantity, different delivery address. Not to the workshop, to a storage unit in Riverside County, under a name I didn't recognize. But the payment cleared from his business card after he was already gone. I passed it to the detectives, and they said they'd look into it. But in that moment, I knew. We weren't anywhere near finished. The lead detective called me back 2 days after I flagged the storage unit. Said they'd gone out there already, no press, no extra cars, just him and 2 evidence techs. The address was in an industrial strip just south of Temecula, rows of units behind a rusted gate, no security cameras facing the right direction. The unit was under the name R. Devers, and the payment had gone through Joseph's business card 2 days after the family went missing. When they opened the roll-up door, it wasn't empty. Half-used buckets of sealant, the kind Joseph had ordered, were lined against the wall. A few concrete molds, some small sculpting tools, and 2 folding tables with receipts, handwritten notes, and packaging materials. It looked like someone had tried to continue the business, or at least mimic it. What stuck out most was that none of it had dust. It had been used recently. The detective didn't tell me much beyond that, but I could hear it in his voice. This wasn't just about what Merritt had taken. It was what he thought he could build off what he destroyed. I sat with it for a while, trying to piece together what he might have been planning. Did he think he could actually keep it going? Use Joseph's brand, his contacts, his inventory. Pretend none of it happened. Or was the unit just a holding place somewhere to shift product until the trail cooled off? I didn't know. But it felt like the first thing in months that cracked the surface. A new address. A real physical link between the disappearance and Merritt's activity afterward. When they processed the receipts found inside one was dated February 9th. 5 days after the last known sighting of the family, and signed J. Halden in a shaky hand that looked traced. The clerk at the materials warehouse remembered a man with gray stubble and paint-stained hands. Said he paid cash for the extras. Described him as polite. Nothing out of the ordinary. That was the pattern. Merritt never raised red flags. He didn't get sloppy. He moved just slow enough, just quiet enough to avoid attention. Even that border footage, grainy as it was, had bought him time. The theory that the Haldens had left on their own, walked across with the kids, got away from something no one else understood, that stayed in people's minds longer than I expected. I remember one woman from Joseph's old neighborhood asking me months later if I thought maybe they did go to Mexico and someone else killed them there. That was the thing about the silence around the case. It made space for people to make things up. And Merritt didn't push back on any of it. He just watched it all unfold. Back in court, his behavior got stranger. He'd changed attorneys again. This time, he said the case was being over-dramatized by law enforcement and that the media had poisoned the jury pool before it even existed. He filed motions to move the trial out of the county, requested his own forensic experts, and claimed he had documentation proving Joseph had planned to disappear. None of it held up, but every new claim added weeks, sometimes months, and all the while the Haldens became more of a headline and less of a family. People forgot that Joey Jr. liked orange popsicles and refused to nap without his elephant, that Johnny once broke his wrist climbing a fence to chase a lizard, that Lena liked to peel apples in one long curl and leave them for the boys like candy. Dad stopped watching the hearings, said it was too slow, too cruel. I kept going. Every time Merritt walked in wearing a county-issue shirt and tried to act like he belonged at a table meant for grieving families and exhausted attorneys, I made myself sit through it. There was something I still didn't understand, and I kept hoping the trial would bring it out. Something in his voice. Some crack. But Merritt didn't crack. He smiled when reporters passed, joked with deputies, sat with his hands folded like it was a routine traffic violation, not the murder of a whole family. And when the evidence was presented, the forged checks, the DNA in the SUV, the hammer, the timeline, he nodded as if he'd already accepted how it would land, like the story had already played out in his head. The prosecution was steady. They didn't sensationalize. They laid it out plainly. How Joseph had trusted Merritt to handle parts of the business. How the payments started going missing. How the last communication from Joseph's phone was to Merritt. How in the days after the family vanished, Merritt drained the account and went on a spending spree. How he didn't report them missing, didn't contact anyone. How he forged Joseph's signature on invoices and moved materials to a storage unit across county lines. How his DNA was found in the car, on the hammer. How the hammer was buried in the same grave as Lena and Joey Jr. They showed photos from the Victorville site, of the disturbed soil, the items found with the bodies, the placement of the remains. The silence in the courtroom got heavier with each image. A few jurors looked down. One of the alternates pressed his fingers together and didn't move for nearly 5 minutes. I stayed in the back near the door and tried to keep my breathing even. I'd seen the photos already, but seeing them with Merritt sitting just 20 feet away made something tighten in my chest. It wasn't rage, not exactly, just something quiet and cold. A finality. But even then, something still didn't sit right. A line from the storage unit receipts caught my attention. One of the packaging slips listed a second name in the authorized pickup field, first initial R, last name Devers. Same alias the unit was leased under. But that name had never shown up in the original investigation. It wasn't a relative of Merritt's. wasn't a known alias, wasn't in Joseph's files. I flagged it, asked the detective if they were looking into it. He said they were. That it could be a dead end, but they couldn't ignore it. He said it quietly, almost like he was talking to himself more than to me. That was the first time I realized Merritt might not have done it alone, or at the very least, someone else knew. Someone helped him hide what he did. And maybe someone helped him plan it. The name R. Devers stayed with me long after I handed it over to the detectives. They said it could be fake, maybe just something Merritt made up to throw off the paper trail. But the longer I looked at how everything had unfolded, the less I believed he'd done this completely alone. Merritt was bold. Yeah, but not especially careful. Not when it came to covering financial tracks. He forged checks with dates out of order, left fingerprints in the car, tried to write off stolen money like it was business as usual. But that storage unit someone had helped. The timing, the location, the fact that it was set up before anyone even realized the family was missing. That kind of planning doesn't happen in isolation. And Merritt wasn't a man who liked to get his hands dirty unless someone else was nearby to hand him a towel. I didn't say any of that out loud. Not to the press, not to Dad. But I started asking quiet questions again. About people Merritt had worked with in the past, especially the ones who disappeared from the picture once things turned public. I started with a guy named Aaron Loach, used to handle warehouse logistics for Earth-inspired creations before Joseph went independent. I remembered seeing his name on an old invoice when I was helping organize tax forms years ago. Found him living in Riverside County, now managing inventory for a landscape supply company. I called, told him who I was, and asked if he had a minute. He hesitated at first, then agreed to meet. We sat on a concrete bench outside a donut shop near Lake Elsinore. He looked tired, like someone who'd been keeping his head down for a long time. Said he hadn't seen Merritt in years, but when I mentioned the name Devers, he paused, looked down at his coffee like it had told him something. Finally said, "I only heard that name once. Real quiet. Back in the day when Chase was short on cash and needed parts from a guy who didn't like receipts." I asked if he meant stolen parts. He just shrugged. Nothing ever showed up on the books. But stuff got built. He wouldn't say more. Got up and left without finishing his coffee. But it was enough. I called the detective that night and told him what I'd heard. He said they were already following a few leads tied to Merritt's past contracts. Construction sites where equipment had gone missing. Fabrication jobs that had been signed off but never completed. He said most of it was too old to prosecute, but the name Devers wasn't new to them either. It had popped up once in a background check tied to a company Merritt was loosely affiliated with in 2009. No address, no real record. Just a listed contact on a job proposal that never materialized. The paper trail vanished after that. I kept pushing. Called a few of Joseph's old clients. One of them, a woman named Darlene Bishop, remembered seeing Merritt at a work site a few days before the family disappeared. Said he was unloading supplies with someone else. Tall guy, shaved head, dark glasses, didn't speak much. When I asked if she'd told the police, she said no. She figured if they needed her, they'd call. It took me a minute to steady myself after that. Because even now, years later, people still assumed it wasn't their place to get involved. That someone else would say something. That silence would keep them safe. The thing that stuck with me most about the storage unit wasn't just the receipt or the alias. It was a sticky note someone had left under one of the shelves. It was cataloged in evidence mostly ignored a scribbled list of initials and numbers. Looked like an order tally. But the handwriting wasn't Merritt's. I'd seen enough of his on fake checks and letters. This one curved differently. Narrower. Left-handed, maybe. It was small, but it meant someone else had stood inside that space. Someone else knew what was being hidden, and if that person had helped move the supplies, they might have helped with more. I tried to let the investigators do their job, tried to trust that the wheels were turning the way they needed to. But patience didn't sit right in my gut anymore. I kept thinking back to the first days after they vanished. How we all looked for reasons to explain it. Maybe a sudden trip, maybe they just needed space. Maybe they'd walked away. But now, standing on the other side of all that, knowing their bodies had been buried in a place so far from home, I kept wondering how many others had accepted the lie just because it was easier, because it was quiet, because it kept them from having to look at the mess underneath. Merritt's preliminary hearing was scheduled again for mid-January. Dad didn't go. Said he was tired of watching that man smile like he was untouchable. I went. Sat near the aisle, close enough to hear everything, far enough not to be seen. The prosecution had filed new exhibits. Photos from the storage unit, the receipts, the sticky note. They didn't say much about the second name, not yet. But I watched Merritt closely when they brought up the purchase order dated February 5th. He blinked once, sat back a little in his chair. Not panic, not guilt, just a flicker. Like something small got knocked loose. The kind of shift you only see if you've been waiting for it. They ended the hearing with a request for additional time to verify new digital evidence. Apparently, one of the units had been connected to a cloud-based access system, something Merritt probably hadn't realized was still pinging logs every time the keypad was used. That data hadn't been reviewed fully yet, but the timestamps could narrow down who entered when and for how long. They were working with a warrant. Said they'd update the court soon. I walked out into the parking lot after that, letting the cool air hit my face. Somewhere behind me, Merritt was being loaded back into a transport van, chain at his waist, blank face, same as ever. But now there was another name in the file, another door that hadn't been knocked on yet. I didn't know if they'd ever find this Devers or whatever his real name was. I didn't know if he'd left the state, changed his face, or buried himself under another false paper trail. But I did know this: Merritt didn't build the silence alone. Someone helped him carry it, and that silence still had edges we hadn't found. The search for our Devers didn't lead where I thought it would. A few days after the hearing, one of the detectives called me, said they'd matched the name to a man out of Hemet Raymond Devers, 51. Used to work odd jobs in construction, bounced around between small supply outfits. He had a couple of old citations, one for vandalism, another for failure to appear, but nothing that raised alarms on its own. What caught their attention wasn't his record. It was the date he'd applied for a new driver's license, February 10th, 2010. Less than a week after Joseph, Lena, and the boys were last seen. And the address on that application, a mobile home lot 30 miles from the storage unit. When the deputies got there, the place was already empty. He'd vacated the property in the middle of the night, left behind a cracked recliner and a stack of mail addressed to names no one could verify. The neighbors said he mostly kept to himself. Talked to a man in a white pickup once or twice a week. The truck was never parked for long. I sat with that for a while. A man who'd never been named and never been mentioned in trial or press. But there he was, quiet, adjacent, pulling just enough strings to stay in the shadows. The detectives said they were widening the search. Looking into cell tower pings, financials, anything that might put him in contact with Merritt before the murders. But nothing surfaced fast. No joint business records, no emails. Just a storage unit rented in his name, a driver's license filed days after the crime, and a handful of warehouse orders connected to Joseph's company. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to change the way I looked at everything. I kept going back over what we knew. Not what was in the file, but what we'd lived through. That final call Joseph made to Merritt, the one that went unanswered. The day the SUV pulled out of the driveway. The time gap between the last confirmed sighting and the missing persons report. It wasn't long, 2, maybe 3 days before concern turned to fear. But in that window, someone had time to organize, to move the bodies, to bury 4 people in a remote patch of desert and return with enough calm to withdraw money, rent space place orders. Merritt wasn't the kind of man who could have done that alone. Not without mistakes, not without breaking. But somehow he didn't. What changed everything was a tool receipt no one caught the first time. It came through a supply chain audit the DA's office was conducting to prepare for the full trial. Buried in a vendor's December 2009 invoice was a special order, a compact sledgehammer, 3 pounds reinforced head, purchased in cash, marked for pickup by R. Devers. The pickup date was January 27th. The hammer matched the forensic damage on Joseph's skull. It was the same weight, same brand, same grip type. The one found in the grave with Lena and Joey Jr. The connection wasn't direct, not legally. But the timing, the overlap between the tool's purchase and the family's disappearance was no coincidence. I drove out to the edge of Hamet one morning. I didn't tell Dad, just got in the car and went. I found the trailer lot, drove through it slow. The unit where Devers had stayed was padlocked now, the windows boarded from the inside. Someone had hung a tarp over the back fence like they didn't want anyone seeing in or out. I didn't get out of the car, just sat there watching the wind roll through the dry trees. There was a feeling I couldn't shake standing on that street. Like if I knocked on enough doors, opened the wrong one, I'd find something I wasn't ready to see. I left after 20 minutes. But I took a picture of the trailer, passed it along to the investigator just in case they hadn't already been out there. The trial itself was dragging again. Merritt had filed a motion to exclude the hammer from evidence, claiming it was circumstantial and had no definitive link to him. The judge denied it, but the back and forth slowed everything. Weeks went by between hearings. The prosecutor called me one afternoon, said he was working on an updated timeline, wanted my input on the family's routine, asked what time Joseph usually got home, whether Lena ever took the kids out at night. I told him what I could, said they were creatures of habit. Dinner around 6, boys in pajamas by 7:30, movie nights on Thursdays if Joseph got off early. He thanked me. Didn't say more. But I could tell they were narrowing in on something, piecing together the missing slivers between the known movements and what came after. What I kept circling back to was the house, the food left on the counter, the half-folded laundry. That movie paused on the TV. Whoever took them, whoever stood in that room and made the decision to erase a family didn't force their way in. There was no break-in, no panic. That meant Joseph let them in, sat down with them maybe, trusted them at least for a moment. I started to believe Merritt wasn't just the orchestrator. He was the lure, the familiarity, and Devers, or whoever he really was, might have been the weight behind it. The one who followed close behind once the door was open. I didn't have proof, but the picture was forming. One night I found myself back in Fallbrook. I didn't mean to drive there, it just happened. The streets were quiet, porch lights blinking on in scattered rows. I turned onto Joseph's old street and parked 2 houses down. I didn't get out, just sat with the windows cracked. It smelled like cut grass and something faintly sweet, maybe jasmine. The kind of scent Lena used to love. I could almost hear the boys through the walls, their laughter echoing off the tile. That's when I realized something I hadn't let myself feel before. We'd been so focused on building the case, on finding the link, that I'd stopped picturing them alive. They'd become names on documents, dates on timelines. But they were real. They had rhythms, favorite songs, inside jokes. That part mattered too. It had to. The next morning, the detective emailed, said they'd finally gotten the access log data from the storage unit's cloud system. There were multiple entries on February 6th and 7th, early morning and late evening. One of them was at 4:17 a.m. No known employee accessed the unit at that time, and Merritt's cell phone was pinging from a location miles away, which meant someone else had the code. Someone else had the key. And whoever it was, whether he called himself Devers or something else, wasn't just a name anymore. He was a presence, still out there, still quiet, still missing. The access logs were what finally did it. After all the paperwork and speculation and waiting, it was the numbers, just strings of time and code, that started to close the distance between what we believed and what we could prove. The unit had been entered 5 times in the days following the family's disappearance. Once at 6:02 p.m. on the 6th, once just before sunrise the next morning. The last entry came 2 weeks later on February 20th. That final one stood out. Merritt was already under quiet surveillance by then. His movements had been tracked, his phone monitored. But on the morning of the 20th, he was recorded at a gas station 70 miles away, meaning someone else had opened that unit. Someone with the code. Someone who either didn't know or didn't care that law enforcement was closing in. They never triggered another log after that. Whoever it was didn't come back. When the trial resumed, the district attorney didn't lead with the storage data. He walked the jury through the bodies first, carefully, with restraint, just the facts. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. Location of burial, shallow graves less than 2 feet deep in an unincorporated stretch of desert in San Bernardino County. Time of death based on the earliest forensic analysis placed it somewhere between the evening of February 4th and the early hours of the 5th. Joseph had been struck multiple times. So had Lena. The boys were likely killed second. No defensive wounds on the younger child. Partial bruising on Johnny's arms, maybe from being held too tightly. There were no drugs in their systems. No evidence they'd been moved more than once. The prosecution didn't dwell on it, just placed it there plainly where it couldn't be ignored. Then came the receipts, the inventory records, the purchases made in Joseph's name after he was already gone. Checks signed with his forged signature. Tool orders placed using old vendor accounts. Merritt's fingerprints on the delivery tags, his handwriting on the scheduling forms. And then the surveillance footage Merritt entering the storage facility twice alone and once in a dark jacket with a man no one could identify. That third time he used a guest passcode, one that hadn't shown up on file until the week before. The timestamp on that code matched the first unauthorized entry, the 4:17 a.m. log. The photo wasn't clear enough to confirm the second man's face, but his build matched Devers. Height, posture, even the slight limp in his left foot visible just for a second as he stepped out of the security light's reach. The defense tried to separate it, said Merritt had used the unit for side projects, said the purchases weren't unusual, that Joseph had trusted him with access, that any gaps in behavior were coincidence, not criminal. But the weight of it, the volume of connections, the overlapping timelines, the digital footprints was too much to ignore. Even without Devers in custody, even without a confession. The picture was full enough now to hold. I sat in the back of the courtroom the day the jury returned. The bailiff called order. The room was still. I don't remember the exact words, only the quiet. the kind that settles like dust on skin. 4 counts. Guilty on all. The jury recommended the death penalty. Merritt blinked once. Didn't move otherwise, no outburst. No speech. He looked almost bored, like it wasn't his name being read. Outside, the press was waiting. Microphones, lights, all the questions I didn't want to answer. I found a side door and walked down the alley behind the courthouse instead. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. A message from Melissa Lena's sister. Just 3 words. They heard us. I didn't write back right away. Just stared up at the flat gray sky and let my shoulders go heavy for the first time in a long time. The sentencing came 3 months later. Merritt sat motionless through the whole thing. When the judge read the decision, he didn't flinch. His attorneys filed an appeal immediately. Said the sentence was too harsh. That California's moratorium on the death penalty made it symbolic and unnecessary. That their client's behavior didn't justify execution. I didn't say anything. Not to the press, not to the attorneys. I let the court speak for itself. The words "without possibility of parole" carried enough weight on their own. After that, the case faded from the news. The headlines disappeared. The reporters moved on. But for us, the noise never fully stopped. Dad still keeps a copy of the original missing persons flyer in his desk drawer. Melissa keeps a photo of Lena taped inside her kitchen cabinet, where she'll see it every morning when she reaches for the coffee. And me, I still wake up sometimes to the sound of gravel, that soft shift of tires pulling out of a driveway. That sound has stayed with me more than anything, because it wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was just quiet, familiar. A door shutting, an engine starting, a family leaving for the last time. The investigators told me they're still looking for Devers. They don't know where he is. No credit trail, no known relatives. It's like he vanished before anyone realized he was ever here. But I don't believe in vanishing anymore, not really. Someone always knows. Somewhere someone's holding a truth they think will keep them safe. And maybe for a little while it does. But silence only holds as long as the people who built it do, and Charles Merritt won't be free to speak again, which means it's only a matter of time before the silence shifts, before the rest of it starts to crack. Charles Merritt will never walk free again. He's serving his sentence at a facility down in San Diego County, one of those long, flat compounds with rows of windows too narrow to see through. No chance of parole, no appeals that hold. And though the state's moratorium on the death penalty means the sentence won't be carried out the way it was written, it doesn't matter. He'll grow old in that place. He'll die there. But that wasn't the end for the rest of us. Justice doesn't undo the silence that settled over the house in Fallbrook. It doesn't lift the dust from the boys' toys or fill the space Lena left in her sister's voice. It doesn't bring Joseph back to his shop or quiet the dogs that waited by the fence for days after the car was gone. It doesn't return what mattered most. But it gave us something solid to hold, a truth we could say aloud. Dad still lives in the same house. He keeps fewer things out-now boxes in the garage, old photos tucked into drawers, but he never took Joseph's picture down from the mantel. Just before the verdict came in, he framed one of Johnny and Joey Jr. at the beach, wrapped in matching towels, laughing at something off camera. It sits beside Lena's graduation portrait. There's not much left to say when I visit, but he still puts the kettle on like he used to. Still asks if I've heard anything new about Devers. I haven't. There have been no new sightings, no updated leads. His name gets mentioned less and less in official calls. Some days I think he's gone for good. Other days I wonder if he's just waiting for someone else to look away. As for me, I went back to work. Not the same kind. I left the installs behind, started helping out with small restorative projects, old properties in need of repair. It's quiet work, which suits me. I don't talk about the case unless someone asks. And when they do, I don't give them the headlines. I tell them what matters. That Joseph made fountains that calmed people down. That Lena carried juice boxes in her purse even when the boys were past the age for it. That they kept a running list on the fridge of things they wanted to fix, build, or grow. They weren't dramatic people. They were builders, makers, parents. They lived a simple, honest life, and that's how I remember them. The trial taught me a lot about systems, about silence, about how quickly people turn facts into stories they can live with. But the part that stayed with me came quieter. It came from the days when there was nothing left to do but wait. When I sat alone in their driveway, windows rolled down, listening to wind move through trees that didn't care who was missing. I realized then that truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the thing that refuses to disappear. The thing you return to again and again until it stops asking to be explained and starts asking to be carried. If you stayed with this story, thank you. These names matter. They weren't strangers. They were family. And if this case sits with you the way it stayed with me, consider sharing it. So no name gets left behind. Not Joseph, not Lena, not Johnny, not Joey. Let them be remembered not for how they were taken, but for how deeply they were loved.